Black Maid asked a billionaire for a small loan to save her mom. Her words left him silent. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Naomi Carter stood outside the tall glass doors of the executive conference room with both hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. The hallway of the Whitmore Grand Hotel stretched behind her like a quiet marble tunnel, polished floors reflecting the cold white lights from the ceiling above. Somewhere far below in the lobby, a piano played a slow melody that drifted upward through the open atrium. But up here on the 30th floor the air felt heavier, quieter, almost sacred. Naomi took a slow breath that trembled before it left her lungs. Her cleaning cart sat abandoned against the wall beside her, the scent of lemon disinfectant faint in the air. She had cleaned dozens of rooms that morning without thinking twice, but standing here felt different. This was the executive level, the place where people like her were never supposed to knock on the door. Inside that room sat Daniel Whitmore, the billionaire owner of the entire hotel chain, a man whose name appeared in business magazines and television interviews, a man people described with words like brilliant, ruthless, untouchable. Naomi had never spoken to him before. She had only seen him once from a distance in the lobby months earlier, walking past security with the quiet authority of someone who owned every inch of the building. Her heart pounded louder with every second that passed. The folded envelope in her hand had grown warm from her grip. Inside were hospital documents, printed test results, and a letter from a doctor whose calm handwriting had delivered the worst news Naomi had ever read. Her mother, Rose Carter, needed immediate heart surgery. Without it, the doctor had written that survival beyond a few weeks would be unlikely. Naomi swallowed hard as that sentence echoed again in her mind. A few weeks. The hospital had explained the cost with polite voices and sympathetic smiles. The procedure, the medication, the operating team, the recovery care. $20,000 just to begin. Naomi had spent the last 3 nights doing calculations in a small notebook at the kitchen table of her apartment. Her entire savings barely reached $2,000. She had sold her old car the day before. She had asked her bank for help and had been refused with a gentle apology. By the end of the night, there had only been one desperate idea left in her mind, one that sounded foolish even as she thought about it. Ask the billionaire. Naomi had almost laughed when the thought first appeared, but desperation had a way of turning impossible ideas into the only remaining option. Her mother had spent 20 years cleaning houses across the city, leaving before sunrise and returning long after dark with tired hands and a soft smile that never complained. Rose Carter had raised Naomi alone, had paid for school supplies, birthday cakes, and rent with money earned from scrubbing floors and washing dishes. Naomi had watched those sacrifices her entire life. Now the roles had reversed. Now it was her turn to fight. The door to the conference room suddenly opened and a group of executives stepped out, their expensive shoes clicking sharply across the marble floor. Their conversation stopped when they saw Naomi standing there in her housekeeping uniform. One man frowned slightly as if trying to understand how she had reached this floor. Naomi felt heat rise into her cheeks, but she did not move. She had already come too far to turn around now. The last executive walked away and the hallway fell quiet again. Through the open doorway, Naomi could see a long table made of dark polished wood and a wall of windows revealing the wide skyline of New York City under a pale afternoon sky. At the far end of the table sat Daniel Whitmore himself, reading a set of documents with calm concentration. Naomi tightened her grip on the envelope. For a moment, she almost stepped back. Security would probably escort her out. She might lose her job. But another image rose stronger in her mind. The image of her mother lying in a hospital bed with pale skin and tired eyes still trying to smile. Naomi stepped forward. Her shoes made a soft sound against the floor as she crossed the threshold into the room. Daniel Whitmore looked up slowly. His sharp gray eyes settled on the young maid standing in front of him. The room felt suddenly colder. Naomi took one more breath and forced the words out before her courage disappeared. Mr. Whitmore, I am sorry to interrupt you. I know I should not be here, but I need to ask you something important. He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with a quiet curiosity. Naomi held the envelope out with trembling hands. "Sir, I am not asking for charity. I only need a small loan to save my mother." The words hung in the air like a fragile glass thread. For several seconds Daniel Whitmore said nothing at all. The billionaire simply stared at her as the skyline glowed behind him, and the silence inside the room grew so deep that Naomi could hear the sound of her own heartbeat. Naomi Carter stood frozen in the center of the conference room as the silence stretched across the long table like a shadow that refused to move. Daniel Whitmore did not speak. His gray eyes rested on her face with a calm intensity that made Naomi suddenly aware of every detail about herself. The faint wrinkle in her housekeeping apron, the cleaning gloves tucked into her pocket, the small scuff on the toe of her shoe from pushing a supply cart through the service hallways all morning. This room was designed for people who negotiated deals worth millions of dollars, not for someone like her who had spent the day scrubbing bathroom tiles and polishing mirrors. Yet here she was, standing under the cold white lights with her entire future balanced on a single request. Daniel Whitmore slowly placed the papers he had been reading onto the table. His movements were controlled and unhurried, the way someone behaves when they are used to making decisions that change entire companies. He folded his hands together and leaned slightly forward. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and steady. "Why are you asking me?" Naomi swallowed hard. The question was not angry, but it carried a quiet weight that pressed on her chest. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind all night, whispering the words to herself in the kitchen while the city outside her apartment window slowly went dark. But now the sentences tangled inside her throat. She forced herself to breathe slowly. "Because you are the only person in this building who could help without it ruining your life, sir." Whitmore watched her carefully. Naomi continued, her voice trembling but determined. "The hospital says my mother needs surgery immediately. Her heart is failing. Without the operation, they say she might not live longer than a few weeks." Naomi held out the envelope with both hands. The paper shook slightly as Whitmore reached forward and took it from her. He opened it slowly and scanned the documents inside. Hospital forms, test results, a letter from a cardiologist explaining the urgent need for treatment. Naomi could see his eyes move across the page with quiet concentration. The silence that followed felt endless. Outside the tall windows behind him, the skyline of New York City glowed under the pale afternoon sun, but inside the room the air felt colder with every passing second. Naomi felt her heart pounding so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. Finally Whitmore looked up again. "How much money are you asking for?" Naomi answered immediately because she had repeated the number so many times that it felt carved into her memory. $20,000, sir. Just to begin the procedure." The words sounded enormous when spoken aloud in a room like this. $20,000 was more money than Naomi had ever imagined holding in her life. It represented years of work, years of rent, years of sacrifice. Yet to someone like Daniel Whitmore, it might be the cost of a single business dinner. Still, the billionaire did not react the way she expected. He did not laugh. He did not show anger. Instead, his expression became thoughtful, almost distant, as if he were examining a problem that did not yet have a clear solution. "And why should I trust that you will repay this loan?" Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "Because I will not disappear. I work here. You know exactly where to find me. I will work every shift you give me. I will clean every room in this hotel if I have to. Every dollar I earn can go toward paying you back." Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair. The quiet authority in his posture made the room feel even larger than it already was. Many people would hear that offer and think it was sincere. But in his world, promises were often worth less than the paper they were written on. "Do you know how many people ask me for money every year?" Naomi shook her head softly. "Hundreds. Sometimes more. People with stories about sick relatives, failing businesses, and desperate dreams. Most of them promise repayment. Very few ever return the money." Naomi felt her stomach tighten. She had expected doubt, but hearing it spoken aloud still hurt. She lifted her head again and met his gaze directly. "I understand why you would not believe me. I probably would not believe me either if I were sitting in your chair." Whitmore studied her with a quiet curiosity. Naomi continued speaking before fear could silence her again. "But my mother spent her entire life cleaning houses for people who had more money than they could ever spend. She never asked them for anything. Not once. Even when her hands hurt so much she could barely hold a broom. Naomi paused as emotion tightened her throat. She forced herself to keep going. I am only asking now because I am afraid that if I stay silent my mother will die, believing that nobody cared enough to try. The words settled into the room like a quiet echo. Daniel Whitmore remained silent again, his eyes fixed on Naomi as if he were searching for something hidden behind her trembling voice. And for the first time since Naomi had stepped into the room, the billionaire no longer looked annoyed or impatient. Instead, he looked thoughtful in a way that made the silence feel heavier than before. Daniel Whitmore remained seated in silence for several long seconds after Naomi Carter finished speaking. The quiet inside the conference room felt heavier than before, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of her words. Outside the enormous windows behind him, the afternoon sky stretched across the city in pale shades of blue and gray, but inside the room the atmosphere remained still and tense. Naomi stood where she was, her hands resting at her sides now that the envelope was no longer in them. She did not dare move. The faint ticking of a clock somewhere on the wall seemed louder with every passing moment. Whitmore lowered his gaze again to the hospital documents resting on the table. In front of him, he studied the pages slowly, reading every line with careful attention. The cardiologist report, the emergency admission note, the projected cost estimate written clearly in bold letters near the bottom of the page. Naomi watched his expression but could not read what he was thinking. His face remained calm and controlled, the face of a man who had spent decades negotiating high-stakes business deals without revealing his emotions. Finally, he placed the documents down and folded his hands again. Tell me about your mother. Naomi blinked in surprise at the question. For a moment, she wondered if she had heard him correctly. About my mother? Whitmore nodded slightly. Yes. You said she spent her life cleaning houses. Naomi felt a quiet warmth rise in her chest at the chance to speak about the woman who had shaped her entire life. My mother is the strongest person I know. She started cleaning houses when she was 19 years old. She used to leave our apartment before sunrise every morning and come home after dark with sore hands and tired feet. But she never complained. Not once. Whitmore listened without interrupting. Naomi continued, her voice steadier now as memories began to replace the fear that had filled her earlier. When I was a child, she would bring me with her sometimes on weekends because she could not afford a babysitter. I would sit on the floor while she cleaned kitchens and living rooms. She used to tell me something every time we left one of those houses. In his chair slowly. His expression remained thoughtful. And now she is the one in the hospital. Naomi nodded. Yes, sir. She collapsed 3 nights ago while she was making dinner. The doctors said her heart is very weak. They explained that without surgery, it will only continue to fail. Naomi took a slow breath as she remembered the sterile smell of the hospital room and the quiet sound of machines monitoring her mother's heartbeat. When I visited her yesterday, she tried to smile like everything was fine, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She kept apologizing to me for being sick. Whitmore raised his head slightly at that. Apologizing. Naomi nodded again. She said she was sorry for becoming a burden. The word burden seemed to echo inside the room. Naomi looked up at Whitmore with quiet determination. My mother has never been a burden to anyone. She gave everything she had to make sure I had a chance at a better life. The least I can do is fight for hers now. Whitmore remained silent again, but something about his expression had changed almost imperceptibly. The distant business-like calm that had filled his eyes earlier was slowly giving way to something more human. Naomi could not yet tell whether that change would help her or not. She only knew that for the first time since she stepped into the room, Daniel Whitmore was no longer looking at her like a stranger who had interrupted his work. He was looking at her like a man who was beginning to understand the story standing in front of him. Daniel Whitmore remained silent after Naomi Carter finished speaking about her mother, and the stillness inside the conference room deepened until it almost felt like the building itself had paused to listen. The billionaire rested his fingers lightly against the stack of hospital papers on the table, his sharp gray eyes thoughtful as he studied the young maid standing across from him. Naomi could feel the tension in her shoulders as she waited. She had said everything she could say. Now the outcome rested entirely in the hands of the man sitting before her. Whitmore slowly leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. His gaze shifted briefly toward the skyline outside the tall windows, where sunlight reflected off rows of glass towers stretching across Manhattan. For a moment he said nothing. Then he returned his attention to Naomi. You understand that what you are asking is highly unusual. Naomi nodded quietly. Yes, sir. Whitmore continued in the same measured tone. Employees do not normally walk into this room to request personal loans from the owner of the company. Naomi felt the weight of his words, but she held her ground. I know, sir. Whitmore tapped one finger lightly on the table. And yet here you are. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. I did not know where else to go. The honesty in her voice hung in the air. Whitmore observed her carefully, as if weighing every movement she made. After a moment he spoke again. Security could have removed you from this floor the moment you stepped off the elevator. Naomi nodded again. I know that too. Why did you take the risk? Naomi lifted her head and met his gaze directly. Because my mother does not have time for me to be afraid. The words were simple, but they landed with quiet force. Whitmore did not immediately respond. The silence stretched once again across the room. Naomi could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Somewhere far below, a car horn echoed from the streets of the city. Life outside continued as normal, while inside the conference room, everything seemed suspended between two possible futures. Whitmore finally stood up from his chair and walked slowly toward the windows. His tall figure moved with calm confidence, the kind that comes from years of leadership and control. He placed one hand lightly against the glass and looked out across the skyline. Naomi remained where she was, unsure whether this movement meant he was considering her request or preparing to dismiss her entirely. After several long seconds, Whitmore spoke again without turning around. Do you know how many people work for this company? Naomi hesitated slightly before answering. I do not know the exact number, sir. More than 12,000 employees across all of our properties. Thousands of families rely on the salaries this company provides. Whitmore turned slowly to face her again. If I start giving personal loans to every employee with a difficult situation, the requests will never end. Naomi felt the truth of his words settle heavily in her chest. She had known from the beginning that this argument would exist. Still she spoke softly. I understand, sir. Whitmore studied her face carefully. Then why come to me? Naomi drew in a slow breath before answering. Because sometimes rules exist for ordinary days. And sometimes there are moments when someone has to decide whether a rule matters more than a life. Whitmore remained motionless for a moment as those words echoed through the quiet room. Naomi continued gently. I am not asking you to change the rules for everyone. I am only asking you to see one person who needs help today. Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were examining a puzzle that had become more complicated than expected. Naomi waited again, feeling her heart beat steadily in her chest. She had crossed every line of courage she possessed simply by standing here and speaking these words. If he said no now, there would be nothing more she could do. Whitmore finally returned to his chair and sat down again slowly. He placed the hospital documents back onto the table and looked at Naomi with an expression that was no longer distant or cold. Instead, it carried a quiet seriousness that suggested he was thinking about more than numbers or policies. Tell me something, Naomi Carter. Naomi straightened slightly. Yes, sir. If I say no to this request, what will you do next? The question caught her off guard, but she answered without hesitation. I will go back to the hospital and sit beside my mother until the doctors say there is nothing more they can do. Whitmore watched her carefully. And after that, Naomi's voice grew softer but steady. After that, I will still wake up tomorrow and go to work. Because that is what my mother taught me to do even when life is unfair. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Something subtle had shifted between the billionaire and the maid standing in front of him, something neither of them had yet put into words. Daniel Whitmore remained seated with his hands folded on the polished conference table, while Naomi Carter stood quietly across from him, the silence between them stretching longer than any moment Naomi had experienced in her life. The city outside the tall windows seemed to move in slow motion, sunlight reflecting off distant buildings, while traffic far below continued its endless rhythm. Inside the room, however, time felt suspended. Whitmore studied Naomi with an expression that had grown more thoughtful with every word she had spoken. The billionaire was used to reading people quickly. Years of business negotiations had trained him to recognize exaggeration, manipulation, and desperation within seconds. Yet the woman standing in front of him did not behave like the people who usually asked him for money. She did not beg loudly. She did not attempt to flatter him. She simply stood there with a quiet dignity that felt strangely unfamiliar in a room where most conversations revolved around profit margins and investment strategies. Whitmore finally spoke again in a calm voice. "Naomi Carter, how long have you worked at this hotel?" Naomi answered immediately. "Almost 2 years, sir. I started in housekeeping on the night shift and moved to the day team about 8 months ago." Whitmore nodded slightly, as if confirming something in his mind. "Do you like your job here?" The question surprised Naomi. She had expected more questions about the hospital bills or repayment plans. Instead, she found herself thinking about the long corridors she cleaned every morning and the guests who rarely noticed the workers who prepared their rooms. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I do." Whitmore raised an eyebrow with mild curiosity. "Even though the work is difficult?" Naomi allowed a small smile to appear for the first time since she entered the room. "Difficult work does not scare me, sir. My mother used to say that honest work builds strong hands and a strong heart." Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, absorbing that answer. He glanced down again at the hospital documents on the table before lifting his eyes toward Naomi once more. "You mentioned that your mother raised you alone." Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." Whitmore continued. "And she worked 2 jobs to support you." Naomi nodded again. "Many years she did." Whitmore tapped one finger gently against the table as if organizing his thoughts. "Then tell me something honestly. Why did you not try to borrow this money from friends or family before coming here?" Naomi took a slow breath before answering. "Because my mother spent her entire life helping the people around her. When neighbors were sick, she cooked meals for them. When someone could not afford childcare, she watched their children for free. The people we know do not have much money. They already struggle to support their own families. I could not ask them for something they do not have." Whitmore listened carefully without interrupting. Naomi continued softly. "I tried the bank first. They looked at my income and said the loan was impossible. After that I sold my car. It was not worth very much, but every dollar helps." Whitmore's gaze sharpened slightly. "You sold your car yesterday?" "Yes, sir." Naomi answered calmly. "The hospital bill is due soon. I did not want to waste time." Whitmore looked down at the table again for a moment. Something about the quiet determination in Naomi's voice seemed to be slowly shifting the atmosphere of the conversation. Most people who entered his office asking for help arrived with elaborate explanations and emotional speeches. Naomi Carter, however, simply described the truth of her situation with calm honesty. Whitmore finally leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the table. "Let me make sure I understand this clearly. You walked into this room knowing that you might lose your job for breaking company policy." "Yes, sir." Naomi answered without hesitation. Whitmore continued. "And you did it anyway because you believe your mother's life is worth that risk." Naomi met his eyes again. "Yes, sir." Whitmore held her gaze for a long moment. Then he asked one final question in a quiet voice. "Naomi Carter, if I lend you this money and something goes wrong with the surgery, what will you do then?" Naomi felt her chest tighten for a moment at the thought. But she answered honestly, "I will still be grateful that someone gave her a chance to live." Whitmore did not speak immediately after that. The room fell silent again as the weight of her answer settled into the air. And in that silence Naomi noticed something unexpected. The expression on Daniel Whitmore's face had softened slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if the billionaire was beginning to see her not as an employee who had broken a rule, but as a daughter fighting for the one person who had sacrificed everything for her. Daniel Whitmore sat quietly after Naomi Carter finished speaking, his eyes still fixed on her face, as if measuring the weight of every word she had said. The room remained silent except for the faint hum of the ventilation system moving air through the tall conference room ceiling. Naomi could feel her heartbeat in her chest, steady but strong. She had crossed every line of fear simply by coming here. Now there was nothing left to hide. Whitmore slowly reached for the envelope again and lifted the hospital documents one more time. He read them carefully, his eyes moving line by line across the printed medical report. Naomi watched him in silence. The afternoon light behind him had shifted slightly, turning the glass walls of nearby buildings outside into bright mirrors reflecting the city skyline. After several moments, Whitmore placed the documents back onto the table and looked up again. His expression was still calm, but the distant formality that had filled his voice earlier seemed to be fading. "Naomi Carter," he said slowly, "when was the last time you visited your mother at the hospital?" Naomi answered softly, "Early this morning before my shift started." Whitmore nodded slightly. And what did the doctors say today? Naomi took a quiet breath before responding. They said the surgery needs to happen soon. They are trying to keep her stable with medication, but they cannot wait forever. Whitmore folded his hands together again. Did you tell her that you came here today? Naomi shook her head gently. No, sir. Whitmore studied her for a moment. Why not? Naomi hesitated briefly before answering. Because she would have told me not to come. She does not like asking people for help. She believes everyone should solve their own problems if they can. Whitmore looked down at the polished surface of the conference table for a moment, as if considering that statement carefully. Then he spoke again. And yet you came anyway. Naomi nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Whitmore asked quietly. Does that mean you disagree with your mother belief? Naomi thought about that question for a moment before answering. No, sir. I think she is right most of the time. People should stand on their own feet whenever possible. But sometimes life places us in situations where standing alone is not enough. Whitmore raised his eyes again. And today is one of those situations. Naomi met his gaze with calm determination. Yes, sir. Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair again, his expression thoughtful. The billionaire had built his reputation by trusting logic, strategy, and discipline. Yet the quiet honesty of the young maid standing in front of him did not follow the usual patterns he was used to analyzing. Naomi had not tried to impress him. She had not exaggerated her story. She had simply described the truth of her life with a clarity that felt impossible to ignore. Whitmore asked another question. If your mother survives the surgery, what do you think she will say when she learns how you found the money? Naomi allowed a faint smile to appear, though her eyes still carried the weight of worry. She will probably scold me first. Whitmore's eyebrow lifted slightly with curiosity. Scold you? Yes, sir. Naomi said gently. She will say that I should not have risked my job by coming here. Then she will probably say that I embarrassed myself by asking a stranger for help. Whitmore leaned forward slightly. And after that? Naomi's voice softened, but remained steady. After that she will hug me and say thank you for trying. The room became quiet again. Whitmore studied Naomi carefully, his gaze thoughtful and searching. Something about her words had clearly touched a place deeper than business calculations or company policy. Finally he spoke again, though this time his voice carried a tone that was less formal than before. Naomi Carter, in my experience people often reveal their true character when they believe they have nothing left to lose. Naomi remained silent, unsure where his words were leading. Whitmore continued slowly. You walked into this room knowing that I might refuse you, knowing that you might lose your job. Yet you came anyway. Naomi nodded softly. Yes, sir. Whitmore's eyes remained on her as he finished his thought. That kind of courage is not something I see very often in this building. Naomi did not know how to respond to that statement, so she simply stood quietly as the billionaire regarded her with a new expression that seemed to carry a mixture of respect and curiosity. Outside the tall windows the sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long streaks of golden light across the glass towers of the city. Inside the conference room Daniel Whitmore leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table as if he were preparing to make a decision that might change more than one life. Daniel Whitmore remained leaning forward over the polished conference table, his hands resting quietly on the dark wood surface, while Naomi Carter stood across from him with calm determination. In her eyes, the late afternoon light had softened, turning the skyline beyond the glass walls into a glowing horizon of gold and amber. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. The silence was not tense anymore. Instead it felt reflective, like the quiet pause between two people who had begun to understand one another. Whitmore finally reached for the hospital papers once again and lifted the final page from the stack. Naomi noticed that he was not reading the medical terms this time. His attention was focused on the handwritten signature of the doctor at the bottom of the report. He studied it, as if the name carried meaning beyond the ink on the page. Naomi waited patiently, her hands folded loosely in front of her apron. She had already said everything she needed to say. Whatever happened next would be decided by the man sitting across from her. Whitmore slowly placed the paper down and looked up again. His voice was quieter now than it had been earlier in the conversation. Naomi Carter, I want you to answer one more question honestly. Naomi nodded. Yes, sir. Whitmore folded his hands together again. If I give you this loan and your mother survives, what will you do with the rest of your life? Naomi blinked slightly at the unexpected question. For a moment, she looked down at the floor as she considered her answer carefully. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I will continue working, sir." Whitmore watched her closely. Naomi continued. "I know that answer might sound simple, but it is the truth. My mother spent her entire life making sure I had the opportunity to stand on my own feet. I want to honor that by living the kind of life she hoped I would have." Whitmore raised an eyebrow slightly. "And what kind of life is that?" Naomi lifted her eyes again. "A life where I do not forget where I came from. A life where I treat people with respect no matter what job they have. My mother always said that the way you treat people who cannot help you says more about your character than the way you treat people who can." Whitmore leaned back slightly as he listened. Naomi continued quietly. "If she survives this surgery, I will work as hard as I can to repay every dollar you lend me. But more important than that, I will make sure she knows that all the years she spent sacrificing for me were not wasted." The room grew silent again as her words settled into the space between them. Whitmore's gaze remained steady on her face. Naomi noticed something in his expression that had not been there earlier in the afternoon. It was not just curiosity anymore. There was a hint of reflection in his eyes, as if her words had stirred memories he had not expected to revisit. Whitmore slowly stood from his chair and walked once more toward the tall windows overlooking the city. Naomi remained still, watching him quietly. The billionaire placed his hands behind his back as he looked out across the skyline. The sun was now descending toward the horizon, casting long golden reflections across the glass towers of Manhattan. After several seconds, he spoke again without turning around. "When I was a young man, my father used to tell me something similar." Naomi listened silently. Whitmore continued. "He built a small grocery store in Brooklyn with his own hands. He worked 16 hours a day for years just to keep the doors open." Naomi could hear a subtle change in his voice now, something more personal than the calm business tone he had used earlier. Whitmore turned slowly to face her again. "He used to say that success means nothing if you forget the people who helped you reach it." Naomi watched him carefully, unsure where the story was leading. Whitmore walked back toward the table and rested one hand lightly against the hospital documents. "Naomi Carter," he said quietly, "the truth is that I have heard many stories in this office over the years. Some were honest and some were not. But very few people speak with the kind of clarity you have shown today." Naomi felt her chest tighten slightly as hope and uncertainty mixed together inside her. Whitmore looked directly into her eyes as he finished speaking. "And that leaves me with a difficult decision to make." Daniel Whitmore stood beside the conference table with the hospital documents resting beneath his hand, while Naomi Carter remained quietly in front of him, waiting for the words that would determine whether hope or heartbreak followed her out of this room. The golden light of the late afternoon continued to fade slowly across the skyline beyond the glass walls, and the long shadows stretching across the polished floor made the conference room feel even larger than before. Whitmore did not speak immediately. Instead, he looked down again at the printed medical report, his eyes tracing the lines of text, as if searching for something hidden between the words. Naomi watched him carefully, but did not interrupt the silence. She understood that a man like Daniel Whitmore did not make decisions lightly. Finally, Whitmore exhaled slowly and lifted the papers in his hand. "The hospital estimate states that the procedure requires $20,000 to begin treatment." Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." Whitmore continued. "And the doctors believe the surgery must take place very soon." Naomi answered softly. "Yes, sir. They said every day matters now." Whitmore walked slowly around the table as if deep in thought. His steps were calm and measured, but Naomi could see the seriousness in his expression. After a moment, he stopped and turned toward her again. "Naomi Carter, you must understand something important. The moment I help one employee with a personal situation, it creates expectations for many others." Naomi nodded gently. "I understand, sir." Whitmore studied her face carefully. "Do you truly understand what that means?" Naomi took a slow breath before answering. "It means people might ask you why you helped me and not them." Whitmore nodded once. "Exactly." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly but then lifted them again with quiet determination. "But that does not change the truth of my situation." Whitmore remained silent for a moment. Naomi continued softly. "My mother does not know that I came here today. She is lying in a hospital bed believing that everything will somehow work out because that is the kind of hope she always carried for other people." Naomi paused as emotion tightened her throat. but she steadied herself before continuing. She spent her entire life giving kindness to people who could never repay her. Now she is the one who needs kindness in return. Whitmore watched her without interrupting. Naomi took another breath. I know that helping me might feel unfair to others, but sometimes fairness is not the same thing as compassion. The room grew quiet again. Whitmore slowly placed the papers back on the table and rested both hands against the edge of the polished wood. Naomi noticed that his eyes had softened slightly, as if he were seeing the situation from a different angle than before. Whitmore spoke again, his voice calm but thoughtful. Naomi Carter, you said earlier that your mother believes people should solve their own problems whenever possible. Naomi nodded. Yes, sir. Whitmore continued. Yet today you came here and asked a stranger for help. Naomi held his gaze as she answered. Because sometimes courage means admitting that you cannot fight alone. Whitmore looked at her for several seconds without speaking. The quiet confidence in Naomi's voice seemed to echo in the room long after the words were spoken. Finally, he asked one more question. If I refuse this request, will you regret coming here today? Naomi considered the question carefully. When she answered, her voice was calm and steady. No, sir. Whitmore's eyebrow lifted slightly. Why not? Naomi replied quietly. Because if my mother does not survive this illness, I want to know that I tried every door before accepting defeat. Whitmore remained still as her words settled over him. The fading sunlight through the windows now painted the conference room in soft shades of amber and shadow. Naomi stood with quiet dignity, her hands relaxed at her sides, no longer trembling the way they had earlier. She had reached the end of everything she could offer except the truth of her heart. Daniel Whitmore looked down once more at the hospital papers, and then back at Naomi. His expression carried a deep seriousness now, the look of a man weighing not only policy or business logic, but something far more human. And in that quiet moment, Naomi sensed that the decision he was about to make might change both of their lives in ways neither of them had expected. Daniel Whitmore remained standing beside the conference table while the final rays of afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished wood surface like a fading line between two different outcomes. Naomi Carter stood quietly in front of him, her posture calm even though the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her chest. Neither of them spoke at first. The quiet inside the room felt almost sacred, as if the entire building were holding its breath while the billionaire decided what kind of man he wanted to be in this moment. Whitmore slowly picked up the hospital documents again and studied the final page. Naomi noticed his eyes pause on the section where the doctor had written the words "urgent cardiac procedure recommended immediately." He read the sentence twice before placing the papers back on the table. Naomi Carter, he said slowly, I want you to understand something about the world I work in. Naomi nodded respectfully. Yes, sir. Whitmore continued in a calm voice. In business, decisions are rarely based on emotion. We rely on numbers, projections, and calculated risk. Naomi listened carefully, unsure where his words were leading. Whitmore walked slowly back toward the tall windows and folded his hands behind his back as he looked out over the city skyline. When someone requests financial assistance, the first question we usually ask is whether the investment will produce a measurable return. Naomi lowered her gaze slightly, but remained silent. Whitmore continued speaking as he looked out over the city streets far below. In most cases, the answer determines everything. Naomi lifted her eyes again and watched him carefully. Whitmore turned slowly back toward her. But your request does not follow that logic. Naomi nodded softly. I know, sir. Whitmore studied her face again. The quiet strength in her posture had not faded despite the long conversation. You did not walk into this room offering me a business opportunity. Naomi answered gently. No, sir. Whitmore nodded once. You came here offering me something far less predictable. Naomi felt her chest tighten slightly. Whitmore continued quietly. You offered honesty. The word hung in the air between them. Naomi did not know what to say, so she simply stood quietly and allowed the moment to pass. Whitmore walked back toward the table again and rested one hand on the stack of hospital papers. For several seconds he stared at the documents without speaking. Naomi could see the reflection of the fading sunlight on the glass behind him, casting long shadows across the room. Finally, Whitmore lifted his head and looked directly at her again. Naomi Carter, do you know why most people fail when they try to convince someone powerful to help them? Naomi hesitated before answering. No, sir. Whitmore spoke calmly. Because they try to impress that person with things they think power respects. Wealth, influence, connections. Naomi listened carefully. Whitmore continued. But power rarely trusts those things. Naomi watched him closely as he finished his thought. What power notices most is sincerity. The room became quiet again after that statement. Naomi felt a strange mixture of hope and uncertainty rising inside her chest. Whitmore looked down at the hospital documents one last time before sliding them slowly across the table toward himself. Naomi Carter, he said in a low, thoughtful voice. Earlier you asked me for a loan. Naomi nodded softly. Yes, sir. Whitmore rested his hand on the papers and continued speaking slowly. But the more I listened to you, the more I realized something important. Naomi waited without breathing. Whitmore looked directly into her eyes. This situation is no longer about money. Naomi felt her heart beat faster as his words settled into the quiet room. Whitmore straightened slightly and folded his hands together again. It is about whether I choose to ignore what I know is right simply because it is inconvenient. Naomi stood perfectly still. Whitmore's gaze remained steady on her face as he spoke the next sentence slowly and deliberately. And that is a question no balance sheet can answer. Daniel Whitmore stood in silence after his final words settled into the quiet air of the conference room, his eyes still fixed on Naomi Carter as the last light of the afternoon slipped slowly behind the tall buildings outside the window. Naomi did not move. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing gently but firmly on her chest, like the pause before a door either opened or closed forever. Whitmore finally reached for the hospital documents again, gathering them carefully into a neat stack, as if the simple action gave him a moment to organize his thoughts. Naomi watched his hands move across the paper, steady and controlled, the same hands that had signed deals worth millions of dollars over the years. Yet in this moment the decision in front of him felt different from any business agreement he had ever faced. After several seconds, he lifted his gaze again. Naomi Carter, he said calmly, there is something you should know about the way I make decisions. Naomi nodded quietly. Yes, sir. Whitmore continued in a thoughtful tone. In business I was taught that every decision must protect the system that supports the people who depend on it. Thousands of employees work for this company. Every policy we follow exists to keep the system stable. Naomi listened carefully, her expression respectful but steady. Whitmore slowly walked toward the window again, placing one hand lightly against the glass as he looked out over the fading skyline. If I begin ignoring those policies for emotional reasons, the system becomes unpredictable. Naomi understood the truth in his words and lowered her eyes slightly. Yes, sir, she said softly. Loan. Naomi nodded softly. Yes, sir. Whitmore lowered his pen to the paper and began writing carefully across the check. But sometimes the right decision is not the one someone asks for. Naomi watched the pen move across the page, her hands trembling slightly now. After a moment, Whitmore finished writing and tore the check from the book. He placed it gently on the table between them before sliding it toward her. Naomi looked down and felt her breath stop when she saw the number written clearly across the paper. $20,000. Whitmore's voice remained calm as he spoke again. This is not a loan. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes, unable to speak. Whitmore looked directly at her and finished his sentence quietly. This is a chance for your mother to live. Naomi Carter stared at the check resting on the polished surface of the conference table as if it might disappear if she blinked too quickly. For a moment she could not move or speak. The number written across the paper looked almost unreal, a quiet promise that the nightmare she had been living for the past few days might finally have an ending. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached forward, but she stopped halfway, afraid that touching it might somehow break the fragile moment. Daniel Whitmore watched her calmly from the other side of the table. The billionaire expression was not dramatic or proud. Instead, his face carried a quiet seriousness, the look of a man who understood that what had just happened inside this room was far more important than any contract he had signed in his business career. Naomi finally lifted the check carefully with both hands. The paper felt light, but the meaning behind it carried the weight of everything she had been fighting for. She looked up at Whitmore, her eyes shining with emotion she was trying desperately to control. Sir, she said softly, I do not know how to thank you for this. Whitmore shook his head gently. You do not need to thank me. Naomi swallowed as she held the check against her chest for a moment. But this will save my mother's life. Whitmore rested his hands lightly on the edge of the table. That is exactly why I did it. Naomi stood silently for a moment, her mind racing with the realization that the impossible had just become real. She thought about the hospital room where her mother lay resting under the quiet hum of medical equipment. She imagined the moment she would walk through the door with this check in her hand and tell the doctors that the surgery could begin. The image made her heart feel lighter than it had in days. Whitmore watched the emotion pass across her face. Then he spoke again in a calm voice. Naomi Carter, there is something I want you to remember about today. Naomi straightened slightly, listening carefully. Whitmore continued. This money does not define your mother worth. Naomi nodded slowly, unsure what he meant. Whitmore explained gently. Your mother was already valuable long before you walked into this room. The kindness and strength you described earlier have far greater value than anything written on that check. Naomi felt her throat tighten again as she listened. Whitmore continued. The check only removes the obstacle that was standing between her and the chance to keep living. Naomi nodded softly. I understand, sir. Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair. Good. Because what truly matters now is what happens after this moment. Naomi looked at him with quiet curiosity. Whitmore folded his hands together as he spoke. Your mother will have the chance to recover, and you will have the chance to continue building the life she worked so hard to give you. Naomi held the check carefully as she answered. I will not waste that chance, sir. Whitmore studied her expression and nodded once. I believe you. Naomi stood quietly for another moment before speaking again. Sir, I promise I will repay this money. Even if it takes years, I will work every day until the full amount is returned to you. Whitmore shook his head slowly. Naomi Carter, you misunderstood something earlier. Naomi looked confused. Whitmore continued gently. I did not give you a loan. Naomi remembered his words from a few minutes earlier and nodded slowly. That is true, sir. Whitmore's expression softened slightly. Which means there is nothing for you to repay. Naomi hesitated. But I still want to earn the opportunity you gave us. Whitmore smiled faintly at that answer. Then do it the way your mother taught you. Naomi looked at him curiously. Whitmore finished his thought quietly. When you see someone else in need someday, help them the way you were helped today. Naomi felt a deep sense of understanding settle in her chest. She nodded slowly. I will, sir. Whitmore stood from his chair and walked toward the tall windows once again as the final light of the day faded across the skyline. Naomi turned toward the door with the check still held carefully in her hands. Before leaving, she paused and looked back at the man who had just changed her life. Thank you, sir, she said softly. Whitmore did not turn around immediately, but his voice carried across the quiet room with calm certainty. Go save your mother, Naomi. Naomi Carter stepped out of the executive conference room with the check held carefully in both hands, as if it were something fragile that needed protection from the world around her. The hallway outside felt strangely different from the one she had walked through earlier that afternoon. The same marble floors stretched beneath her feet, and the same quiet lighting glowed along the walls, yet everything seemed brighter now. Her heart was still racing, but the fear that had followed her all day had finally begun to fade. She moved quickly toward the elevator at the end of the corridor, pressing the button with trembling fingers. While she waited, she looked down again at the check. The number written across the paper still felt unreal. $20,000. Enough to give her mother the surgery the doctors said she needed. Enough to turn desperation into hope. The elevator doors opened with a soft sound and Naomi stepped inside, clutching the check against her chest as the doors closed, and the car began descending toward the lower floors of the hotel. The ride felt longer than usual. Naomi watched the glowing numbers above the door change slowly as the elevator moved downward through the building. With every floor, her thoughts returned to the hospital room where her mother was resting. She imagined walking through the doors and handing the check to the nurse at the front desk. She imagined the doctor explaining that the surgery could begin. Most of all, she imagined the moment she would tell her mother that everything was going to be all right. When the elevator reached the lobby, Naomi hurried across the polished floor toward the staff exit. A few co-workers looked at her curiously as she passed, noticing the emotion in her eyes and the urgency in her steps, but Naomi did not stop to explain. She pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the cool evening air of the city. The sky above Manhattan had turned deep blue as the sun disappeared behind the skyline. Streetlights had begun to glow along the sidewalks, and the distant sound of traffic filled the air. Naomi raised her hand to signal a taxi, and one quickly pulled to the curb beside her. She climbed inside and gave the driver the name of the hospital where her mother had been admitted 3 days earlier. The car pulled into the flow of traffic and began moving through the busy streets of the city. Naomi held the check tightly in her hands the entire ride. Her thoughts moved quickly between hope and disbelief. Just a few hours earlier she had believed she was running out of time. Now she carried the answer she had prayed for. The taxi finally stopped in front of the hospital entrance, and Naomi rushed through the sliding doors into the brightly lit lobby. The smell of disinfectant and the quiet beeping of medical equipment greeted her as she approached the reception desk. The nurse looked up with a polite smile as Naomi spoke quickly, explaining that she had the payment needed to begin the surgery for Rose Carter. The nurse examined the check carefully before nodding and calling another staff member to assist. Within minutes, Naomi was led down the familiar hallway toward her mother room. When she stepped inside, she saw Rose Carter resting quietly in the hospital bed, her face pale but peaceful beneath the soft glow of the overhead light. Naomi walked slowly to the bedside and gently took her mother's hand. The older woman opened her eyes and smiled faintly when she saw her daughter standing there. "Naomi, you should be at work," Rose said softly. Naomi shook her head and placed the check gently on the small table beside the bed. "Everything is going to be all right now, Mom. The doctors are preparing for your surgery." Rose looked confused at first, then surprised as Naomi explained what had happened that afternoon. When she finished speaking, the older woman's eyes filled with tears. "Naomi, you should not have asked someone for something like that," Rose whispered. Naomi smiled gently as she squeezed her mother's hand. "I did not ask for charity, Mom. I asked for a chance." Rose looked at the check again before turning back to her daughter. "Who helped you?" Naomi paused for a moment, remembering the quiet figure standing beside the window in the conference room. "A man who remembered what his father taught him about doing the right thing," she said softly. Rose Carter closed her eyes for a moment as tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. Naomi leaned closer and hugged her gently. Outside the hospital room, doctors and nurses were already preparing for the procedure that would give Rose Carter another chance at life. And far across the city, in a quiet conference room high above the skyline, Daniel Whitmore stood alone beside the window looking out over the glowing lights of Manhattan, knowing that for the first time in a long while he had made a decision that no business report could measure, but his conscience would remember forever. The night of the surgery passed slowly inside the quiet halls of the hospital, as Naomi Carter sat beside her mother's bed with both hands wrapped around the warm paper cup of coffee a nurse had given her hours earlier. The fluorescent lights in the waiting area cast a soft pale glow across the empty chairs, while the steady rhythm of footsteps from nurses moving through the corridor echoed faintly in the distance. Naomi had barely slept since arriving at the hospital earlier that evening. Every minute felt longer than the last. Her eyes occasionally drifted to the large clock on the wall, watching the hands move forward while she whispered silent prayers for the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise her. When the surgeon finally stepped into the waiting area, just before sunrise, Naomi rose from her chair, so quickly that the coffee cup nearly slipped from her hands. The doctor's expression was calm, but kind as he removed his surgical cap. "The procedure was successful," he said gently. "Your mother's heart is strong enough to recover now." Naomi felt the tension leave her body all at once. Tears filled her eyes as relief washed over her like warm sunlight after a long storm. "Thank you," she whispered, pressing her hands over her mouth as emotion overwhelmed her. Later that morning, Naomi was allowed to step quietly into the recovery room, where Rose Carter rested beneath clean white blankets. Her mother's eyes opened slowly when she heard Naomi's voice. The older woman smiled weakly but warmly. "You see," Rose said softly, "sometimes hope arrives when we least expect it." Naomi laughed through her tears as she sat beside the bed and held her mother's hand. Weeks passed after that night, and Rose Carter's strength returned day by day. The doctors were pleased with her recovery, and soon she was able to walk slowly through the hospital hallway with Naomi supporting her arm. When the day finally came for Rose to return home, the nurses gathered near the doorway to wish her well. Naomi thanked every one of them before guiding her mother out into the warm afternoon sunlight waiting outside the hospital entrance. Life gradually settled into a new rhythm after that. Naomi returned to work at the Whitmore Grand Hotel, just as she had promised herself she would. The hallways were the same, and the work remained just as demanding as before, but something inside her had changed. Every time she pushed her cleaning cart through the long corridors, she remembered the moment she had stood in the conference room and asked a stranger for help with nothing but courage and honesty. Several weeks later, Naomi received a message asking her to come to the executive office on the top floor. When she stepped inside the familiar conference room, Daniel Whitmore was standing beside the window once again, looking out across the skyline of the city. He turned when she entered and nodded politely. "How is your mother doing, Naomi Carter?" Naomi smiled with quiet gratitude. "She is stronger every day, sir. The doctors say she will live a long time." Whitmore nodded slowly as he listened. "I am glad to hear that." Naomi hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I have not forgotten what you told me that day." Whitmore raised an eyebrow slightly. "And what was that?" Naomi answered softly. "That someday when I see someone who needs help, I should help them the same way you helped us." Whitmore's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. "That is the only repayment I ever asked for." Naomi nodded with quiet determination. "I promise I will keep that promise." Whitmore looked back out toward the city skyline as the afternoon sun reflected across the glass towers of Manhattan. In the reflection of the window, Naomi could see both of their silhouettes standing in the quiet room. After a moment, Whitmore spoke again in a calm, thoughtful voice. "Sometimes the most valuable investments are not the ones written in financial reports." Naomi understood exactly what he meant. She smiled gently before turning toward the door. As she walked back into the hallway, the soft echo of her footsteps followed her down the corridor, but this time her steps felt lighter than they had ever been before. Somewhere across the city, Rose Carter was sitting by the window of their small apartment, watching the sunlight spill across the room, grateful for another day of life that had been made possible by a single moment of courage and kindness between two strangers. And although Daniel Whitmore had once been a man known only for his wealth and business success, one quiet decision inside a conference room had reminded him that the greatest measure of power was not how much someone owned, but how much good they chose to do with it.